I'm Natalia Loback, and this is Change the Conversation. I'm the founder and principal of Chart House Advisory Services, and I'm here today with Chris Carter, who is the founder and principal of Org Shift Solutions. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Natalia. Been looking forward to this.
Thanks, Chris. So, for everyone who's watching, Chris and I have worked together quite a bit in our current journey as independent consultants working in change. And we have some really interesting intersections where we often find places where our skills can be really valued and used. So one of the areas, Chris, that you really are excellent in is facilitation. So can you tell me a little bit about how in your work change and facilitation go together?
Well, without good facilitation, I'm not sure you can have good organizational change or good group-oriented change. Why I got into consulting many years ago was in fact due to being introduced to the concept of facilitation by a very cherished mentor back when I was living in Vancouver in the early 90s. I realized then that I was really enjoyed the process of facilitation, that it was something that stirred something very deep inside me around how I can be part of a change process rather than just the IT project manager role that I'd been filling up until that time. And along with getting my master's in organizational development from Antioch University in Seattle, I was able to springboard into a career that was initially primarily based as me as an independent practitioner to provide facilitation services to nonprofit groups, as well as to other consulting firms for both public and private sector clients. I realized there was something. I loved the tap dancing, intuitive, in the moment, trying to read what the group is doing and help them nut through a problem and come out the other side. I realized I really liked breaking assumptions about what groups can do and be able to achieve through sort of just enough, just in time facilitation without being heavy-handed about it. And I've carried that through near the back end of my career that got the bookends some time with some large management consulting firms. Now that I'm independent again, and I've come back to that, but the difference now is that we can't do it in person as much. We have to do it digitally. So that's the other area I've been spending a lot of time in.
It's so interesting. And we're going to get in a little deeper into digital facilitation in our next conversation. But what I thought, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about my experience as an IT project manager and just how desperately change management and change facilitation was needed in those, in those environments, and especially around the problem solving. So when you've got, a really complex change ahead, and one group is driving it and they sort of have an idea about how things are going to work, that powerful opportunity to bring others into that conversation and say, what are some different solutions that we can come up with? What are some other ways that we can solve this problem has been an incredibly impactful method for me. So, do you have an example that you could share that talks a little bit about the power of that facilitation as a tool in change?
Well, I could draw on a few, and I'm going to come back to that because I had a thought that you said when you mentioned about IT experience, that I think part of me when I'm working on groups either doing strategy making or transformation sort of program delivery, so many of those programs are pretty much always IT enabled. And so that becomes the hammer that most people use, or the lever, maybe I can use that word instead. That is the primary lever. And I think what's missing is that in most of those conversations around change as IT enabled, is that there's some other levers you need to pull too. And that is, yes, you need a good process. You need to redesign and re-engineer and rethink. And you need people to be part of that conversation about how to do that rethinking. That isn't just an imposed top-down change, that they are involved in hopefully the formulation of these new processes, which makes the change management exercise and adoption of new ways of working together much easier because they were involved from pretty much the get-go, or a proper representational group that was involved in that others in a stakeholder group could see, yeah, I'm just like Joe, or I'm just like Jill, and they were involved, so therefore I trust the output, which I think gets us to the change. But your question was more about facilitation itself.
And that's okay, Chris. Like I have to say that I really resonate with what you're saying around that stakeholder engagement, involvement, representation, and bringing people into the solution development, making that an active part of their change experience. So powerful and so important. So thank you for that, because I think that'll be really interesting for our viewers to think about. Now, I'd like to close off this conversation today with just, like I said, as you were just going to jump into that example. So do you have like a quick client story that you could share with the viewers for the end of this conversation today?
Certainly. It's an example that is pandemic driven. It is I'll call it a Greater Toronto Area suburban library that had a new CEO appointed during the initial phases of the pandemic, where this particular institution hadn't had a strategic plan done for over 8 years, and had this fairly traumatic change of a CEO kind of being let go, let's put it that way, and a new one being appointed coming from the private sector. The organization was in some turmoil, and through this process of doing a strategy making exercise that proceeded over a number of months, that had a high degree of involvement from not just the senior leadership team, but an expanded strategic sort of task force, through to, in fact, a fairly deep level consultation across the organization in a number of modes. Not just having facilitated conversations, which was a big part of it, but also doing things like an organizational culture survey to find out what's truly going on in the organization that needs to be addressed in order to make it a higher performing organization, which was the CEO realized. He didn't know the organization, and because of the pandemic, hadn't had an opportunity to kind of walk the stacks and the actual library locations. Couldn't do it. So how do you build team? How do you build strategy together? And that's what that particular project was all about. And so we designed, myself and my team, my colleagues, designed a number of mechanisms for people to have meaningful dialogues. And we followed that sort of base philosophy and principle all the way through. Yes, the ultimate decision-making did sit with the CEO, but he realized that if he didn't, in fact, involve people appropriately, and not just for input, but for true contribution, that they needed to be part of making the new strategy, of thinking about new strategy, and struggling with the process of creating new strategy, that the outcome would be and the output would be better overall.
Amazing, Chris. I'm actually really excited because we're going to be back for 2 more conversations. The first one, we're going to get more into what digital facilitation and engagement looks like. And second, we're going to talk a little bit more about this really interesting client story that you just started to tell us. So thank you for joining me today, Chris.
Thank you.